Hey everybody, welcome back. So far we've talked quite a bit about how we kind of determine uh, what strategy we want to take in a very simplistic manner, and the kind of the things that we take into consideration for like creating some sort of sustainable advantage for ourselves. How do we bake these things into a strategy, right? Well, all of these, much like we do in business a lot, we've talked about them a bit in stasis. We've kind of talked about them kind of just being. But much like hopefully has been stressed to you throughout your business school career, we have to understand that these things can't stay static forever, right? These have to be dynamic variables that are changing all of the time. And one of the difficult things about strategy is this idea that the elements that affect it never stay the same. So the dynamic nature of strategy really suggests something quite critical to us that we hope to just unpack here, and that is strategies have to evolve. They have to continue to change. And what we're also going to hint on just a little bit in this video is this idea about what might be the major force that impacts that style of change. But first and foremost, we want to really stress with you that, a company's proactive strategies, because we will have proactive and reactive strategies, but let's start by focusing on this purple element here, right? The company's proactive strategy element includes newly crafted strategies, things like that, initiatives, plus, let's say, ongoing strategic elements that have continued from prior periods that have worked well for us, right? These are our proactive elements. We always talk about these as being one of the feeding forces into the latest version of our strategy, right? We've got proactive strategies and we've got reactive strategy elements. Our reactive strategy elements are going to be, our new strategic elements we always add in this dynamically changing environment that emerge as we react to these changing circumstances. So all of these things, right? We would have prior versions. We may have abandoned some things that worked for us in the past that aren't working any longer. We may carry some things forward that did work for us from prior versions. That's great. And we may be adding new things, like it says here in our reactive and proactive elements of, we might just need to be adding things that are based off of the new climate that we're a part of, right? It shows us that, changing a firm's strategy is really necessary over time. And it's based off of a lot of things. We might have changing market conditions. We may have advancements in technology. We might see, new moves taken by our competitors that cause us to need to react and do things differently. There may be buyer needs or preferences that change based off of, social trends and the ways that we think, new ideas for how we improve our strategy. We might have evidence that the strategy we're using isn't working very well, all these kinds of things. A firm's latest version of our strategy should reflect basically the deletion of obsolete or ineffective elements from our past strategies and adherence to the things that are working or new ideas that we think could shift with the changing trends. Now, the biggest thing that I think works well for us to give as an example here is this idea of, our changes in moral and ethical, let's say, social views. This is one of the the strongest elements that affects changes in strategy any longer, is this idea that like we have drastically changing societal views about what is ethical, what's moral, what's responsible. And as a result of that, it really plays in well as we talk about why strategy needs to evolve, this conversation about what really makes one of our strategies ethical, because this is one of the elements that forces us to change often, is changing societal ideas about what it is to be ethical. So let's throw this out here real quick. A strategy, right? The big thing that we get to talking about is the difference between ethical and legal. And a strategy is not necessarily going to be ethical just because it's legal, right? A legal strategic action does not mean that it is ethical. It just means you are abiding by the laws, but sometimes, certain things, when we hear people hide behind that veil of legality, still don't really rub us the right way, do they? Right? Doesn't necessarily mean that just because it's not against the law that it's really a morally acceptable or ethically acceptable approach to a strategy, right? what ethical really means when we talk about it from this business standpoint is, you know, um, ethical standards are about what we feel are right versus wrong, right? What's moral versus immoral? What kinds of things, we call this the moral scrutiny test in that sense, right? We want strategies like the way that we are trying to accomplish our success need to be, they need to feel moral versus objectionable, right? Not crossing that line from should do to I probably shouldn't do that kind of thing, right? Ideas such as, right, within these bounds, this is acceptable versus outside these bounds, not quite as acceptable, right? We want to really stress this with our strategies because there are a lot of paths, like we said, we could take, and there are plenty of them that are legal, but it doesn't necessarily mean they're super moral or ethical in that sense. So a lot of strategic actions kind of fall in like what we call this like gray zone that can be deemed either ethical or unethical depending on how high of a ethical or moral bar we're setting for ourselves, right? So there's not necessarily going to be a black and white to this type of decision making, but understanding that our changing societal ideas about what's moral or ethical are really going to drive this idea about how do we need to start adjusting the strategy that we're using as a firm. So I know you're going to do one discussion this week, so I give you some suggestions, but just another one that you might throw out there if you're really interested in this idea. Just take a little time, maybe write a little bit about this in your discussion this week if you'd like. This idea about what kind of business behaviors you might be able to identify by some real world examples or just some things you might think up in your mind that might be technically legal, but not necessarily the most ethical or morally acceptable by our current societal standards. If this interests you, you know, take that and run with it. Talk a little bit about it in your discussion this week.